Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Professor Bobby Chesney. I'm the director of the Robert Strauss Center for International Security and Law here at the University of Texas. On behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Will Inboden, who's the executive director of the Clements Center for National Security, Dr. Varun Rai, who's the associate dean for research here at the LBJ School, as well as curator of the LBJ School's PhD colloquium series, of which this event is part. I'm very pleased to welcome you all today. Texas' 20th Congressional District. It's a special place. It covers much of the west and northwest sides of my hometown, San Antonio, the one and only. San Antonio is a place with a deep connection, both historically and even more so perhaps currently, to our nation's foreign affairs, to our military and our intelligence communities. And so it's only fitting that it be represented by someone who has a strong vision for and understanding of those very matters. That's exactly the case with Congressman Joaquin Castro. He grew up in San Antonio before he headed off to Stanford and then on to Harvard Law. But he got back home straight away to pursue both his private law practice for a time and increasingly his calling to public service. Personally, sir, I think you just missed the good food. And I will say that I checked out the exact boundaries of the 20th District, and I was utterly horrified to see that there's a spot where it goes along Hildebrand that misses both Chris Madrid's and the original Blanco Cafe.
We'll try to change that next time.
Yeah, I was going to say, redistricting takes on a whole new meaning. The congressman was in the Texas legislature in very short order for what were 5 immensely successful terms before moving up to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2012. He's now in his 3rd term, and he's serving critical roles both on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the acronym for which is usually pronounced HPSI, so you'll hear some HPSI talk today and you'll know what it is, and the House Foreign Affairs Committee as well. So we're very fortunate to have you with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Congressman Joaquin Castro.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bobby, for that introduction. And that's the first time I've heard a suggestion of gerrymandering by restaurant. Right? But we may take you up on that. So thank you, everybody, for being here today, and thank you to the LBJ School and UT Austin for hosting. I want to thank the Clements Center for National Security, the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, of course, the LBJ School, and the Texas National Security Network for hosting me and for providing us this forum. And also a special thank you to Will and Bobby, who did so much and worked with my staff for quite a while to organize this event. I appreciate that. The Texas National Security Review brings issues of national interest to Texas and reaffirms Texas's place in the global foreign policy and national security discussion. And I'd like to recognize also all of the students, both undergraduates and graduates, who have joined us today. Best of luck. First, congratulations on everything that you've accomplished so far, and best of luck in your studies in the years ahead. You really are the nation's leaders, our nation's leaders, and it's great to see all of you engaged on these foreign policy issues. So, as was mentioned, I'm Joaquin Castro, and I represent the 20th Congressional District in San Antonio. It's the main congressional district there in that we have parts of 5, just as Austin, I think, has parts of 5. But the 20th is the only one that is completely within Bexar County. So I'm in my 3rd term in Congress, and am the only Democrat that's both on the Intelligence Committee and on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm also first vice chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and founded a few foreign policy caucuses since I've been in Congress. The first one in 2013 was the U.S.-Japan Caucus, which I founded with Congressman Devin Nunes from California in 2013, before he was chairman of the Intelligence Committee. And so that one's been going very strong now for 5 years or so. The second one is the U.S.-ASEAN Caucus, which I founded with Republican Congresswoman Ann Wagner in 2017. That one's still a lot smaller than the U.S.-Japan Caucus, but growing in a strong way. So before we talk about U.S. foreign policy and some of the challenges that we face in Congress and some of the debates among the American people, I'd like us to consider for a second the United States' place in the world and what I think this nation means to the American people and what it means to the people of the world. If you ask somebody who was living around the world, in Africa or Asia or Latin America or Europe or anywhere else, 50 years ago, where on earth they would want to go if they were going to leave their home country, 50 years ago, for all the work that we still had to do in terms of civil rights and voting rights and women's rights, the answer was very clearly the United States of America. And we should ask ourselves how exactly that came to be. Why is it that our nation was seen as the place to go? I think there are many reasons, of course, but one of the most powerful and important is that over the generations, the people of the United States of America have built up what I call an infrastructure of opportunity. What I mean by that is that just as there's an infrastructure of roads and streets and highways that helps all of us get to where we want to go on the road, if you think about it, the beauty of this country is that we have built up an infrastructure of opportunity that allows people to try to get to where they want to go in life. So when we think about domestic policy issues, like building great schools and universities like this one, a strong healthcare system, making sure that people can see a doctor, when we talk about building a strong economy so that when people work, they can support themselves and their family members, what you're talking about are the foundations for an infrastructure of opportunity so that people can pursue their American dreams. And I believe that, among other things, that is what has distinguished the United States among the nations of the world. And part of the reason that past generations wanted to come to America is because we represented opportunity, a leader amongst nations, and defender of peace, stability, and democracy, along with the other things that I described. But of course, our world is a much different place today than it was 50 years ago. We really are in a time of transition, perhaps transformation, as the institutions and norms that have governed the world for 70 years are being challenged, rethought, and even reformed. This is by no means an exhaustive list that I'm about to go through, but rather a sampling to begin our discussion in just a second. So, for example, right now there are 70 million people around the world who are displaced from their homes. We're facing one of the deepest humanitarian crises around the world. Europe is still facing its largest migration since World War II due to the civil war in Syria, as well as Iraq and Libya. In the Western Hemisphere, closer to home, of course, 1 million Venezuelans over the last few years have left Venezuela and the Maduro regime, many of them for the neighboring nation of Colombia. In Myanmar, we've had the repression and slaughter of Rohingya, many of whom have gone to Bangladesh. We're also facing a world where American leadership is not unchallenged. For many years, we existed in a bipolar world with the United States and the Soviet Union as two leaders vying for global leadership. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States enjoyed predominance on the world stage. But now, we have a rising power in Asia. That is, of course, the country of China, that has the world's second largest economy. And their economy may surpass ours in just over 10 years if things go well for them. Not only is China looking to eclipse us economically, we see them acting more aggressively on the world stage. They're militarizing features in the South China Sea, threatening skirmishes with neighbors like Japan over the Senkaku Islands, and also advancing an agreement called RCEP, similar to TPP, in order to establish the rules of the road in terms of trade in the Pacific region. They've also established their first military base outside of mainland China in Djibouti over the last few years. We've also seen terrorism franchise at an alarming pace around the world. We're seeing this more and more in North Africa and the Middle East, but also across Europe, Asia, and even in our own backyard through internet recruitment and radicalization. In Africa, groups like Boko Haram have wrought incredible terror, inflicted a lot of damage and pain on peoples there. But close to home, these foreign policy challenges are more often than not knocking on our own borders. As I mentioned, some of the greatest refugee crises of our time in Syria, Burma, and Venezuela, as I mentioned those, we're also seeing a refugee crisis of our own here in the United States. In Texas, we've seen hundreds of thousands flee their homes to escape violence and fear of persecution and make their way here. Most of them are women and children coming from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, heading towards the Texas-Mexico border in search of safety and comfort. We're seeing world leaders also attack the free press, most recently in Turkey, with Saudi Arabia's murder of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. But here at home in the past week, there have also been 10 pipe bombs mailed to those who have been outspoken against President Trump. Abroad, we're seeing people like Vladimir Putin crack down on the LGBT community across Russia. But at home, our administration is currently considering narrowly defining gender as a biological immutable condition determined by genitalia at birth. This is one of the most drastic moves yet in a government-wide effort to roll back recognition and protections of transgendered people under federal civil rights law. These are just a few examples of foreign and domestic policies merging together. In academia, in Congress, or in our own minds, we sometimes try to separate out those two things, but we're seeing the two conflate to levels unseen before, or at least in a very long time. Given the scales of crisis, our world needs leadership. But this administration has demonstrated its desire to pull America back from the world stage and align our nation with world despots like the one in Russia, Saudi Arabia's Mohammed bin Salman, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Turkey's Erdogan, and Duterte in the Philippines. You may have heard recently that after the election in Brazil of a far-right president who's made fascist statements, that night President Trump called him right away to congratulate him. The important role here for Congress is that we do oversight and that we create a foreign policy that will bridge this growing divide in our society, that we speak about American values and the importance of those values, and that we make sure to maintain decades-old alliances with important allies and nations around the world. Our approach to foreign policy must rest on the pillars of transparency and accountability that pave the way for an infrastructure of diplomacy. So some important questions that we must confront. And of course, the conduct of foreign policy for Congress and for Americans generally, when we consider these issues, are sometimes tough and sometimes bring morally uncomfortable questions. For example, do we partner with a repressive government to address a more compelling national security interest? Do we take on a disproportionate burden in an alliance when our partners are unable or unwilling to take responsibility for their own shares? Do we put pressure on close allies that are engaged in business practices with an adversary that hurts U.S. interests? If our diplomats and military are to receive continued support from the American people for their mission, lawmakers must do a better job explaining these decisions to the American people. Failure to do so risks undermining the mandate of the people for our country's role as a leader among nations. This transparency cannot only come about every 2 years during an election cycle. It needs to be a continuing process with votes in Congress, town halls with constituents to discuss these issues, proper oversight during hearings and committees, and openness from the administration and from members of Congress. To earn the trust and support of the American people, there must also be accountability. This goes hand in hand with transparency. Right now, our nation is engaged in a number of military conflicts around the world. U.S. forces are operating in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, parts of West Africa, and other deployments rarely discussed sometimes in the news. Many of these deployments stem from a broad authorization for the use of military force passed in the wake of the September 11th attacks. The context of the war on terror has changed in the intervening years, and I believe Congress needs to take charge and responsibility for our military deployments by passing a new AUMF tailored to the challenges that we face today. Congress needs to take a more assertive role when it comes to arms sales, foreign assistance, sanctions, and our country's commitment to multilateralism. Having these votes puts members of Congress on the record and shows the American people that we have the courage to make our positions clear. On these two pillars of transparency and accountability, we can build out an infrastructure of diplomacy that serves the interests of the American people. Transparency and accountability also allow lawmakers and those in national security to make the case to the American people through their actions rather than through words, the values of continued American leadership in the world. These two pillars also encourage an inclusive foreign policy that takes into account the diversity of views in our country. It also creates a direct link between the people and our foreign policy through elected representatives, so consequential decisions like trade agreements, military deployments, or foreign assistance better address the needs of the American people. The more we invest in long-term diplomacy and development abroad, the more we grow the global economy, create diplomacy amongst nations, and keep our sons and daughters in the military out of harm's way. I opened partly by reminding us that 50 years ago, if you asked somebody around the world where on earth they would want to go if they were going to leave their home country, the answer 50 years ago would have very clearly been the United States of America. In all of the work that we do in Congress, in all of the work that you do, the challenge for us as Americans is to make sure that when you ask that same question 50 years from now of somebody living in Europe or Africa or Latin America or Asia or anywhere around the world, that the answer is still the United States of America. Thank you.
Congressman, thank you so much. What we're going to do now is a little brief moderated dialogue, and this is really just to prime the pump so that you can have a few moments to think of the questions you're going to ask. Pretty soon I'll be directing the microphone to begin circulating, and so be ready to jump into the conversation, because it's really the most interesting part is when we can all dialogue together. So we talked about the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and
Right.
You mentioned the important role of congressional oversight. We haven't always had this institution. Since the 70s we've had it, and congressional oversight plays this almost indispensable function where you have activities that necessarily must be secret for them to actually be effective, espionage, covert action, whatever it may be. At the same time, it's a democratic, free, and orderly society in which there must be some amount of knowledge of these activities so that there can be a proper accountability for them. And we need these committees to function well in order to provide that oversight. I think it's no secret that HPSI is not functioning well currently. Yeah. Can you reflect on what the deeper causes of that dysfunction are and what the path out of that mess might be and why it matters?
Yeah, no, you ask a great question, and that is the role of HPSI and in the Senate, CISI, and the intelligence community to our nation's security. And there are a few committees in Congress that traditionally have been fairly bipartisan, right? If you turned on C-SPAN and you watch a meeting of the Judiciary Committee or the Energy and Commerce Committee, or the Financial Services Committee, you'll often see people fighting and sometimes bickering very vociferously, very passionately. But on committees like Foreign Affairs, to some extent Armed Services, and certainly on intelligence, historically, there had not been a lot of fighting, a lot of debate and discussion, but not a lot of partisan, rancorous fighting. And what we saw, particularly with the events in the Russia investigation, was that committee start to take a turn towards what happens in some of the other committees. In addition to that, I think part of what has made the work difficult is the president's posture towards the intelligence community. This is a president that has repeatedly beat up on our intelligence agencies, basically on the personnel who are part of those agencies, and that has affected morale in those places. And has also created, I think, a kind of dynamic within the committee that it basically added a certain adversarial element, because you've got somebody, I think, like Devin Nunes, who early on in this term decided that he was going to be the president's main protector. Well, that included not only the midnight run to go collect and share intelligence information with the White House, but also once you had folks from the intelligence agency who were in front of us, oftentimes the relationship was much more adversarial between Devin and others on the committee, because it was part of this larger context of what was going on with Russia and the president.
Speaking of the intelligence community itself, it faces a variety of challenges. There's technological change, there are international adversaries, there is the domestic political climate. Setting aside the role of Congress and the political aspects and focusing only on the other types of challenges the intelligence community faces, can you share your thoughts on what the major issues seem to be from your vantage point? What is it we should all be thinking about in terms of what the CIA is facing, what the NSA is facing, and perhaps other parts?
Well, and of course, I'll be careful on some of it, right? But generally, our ability to collect information, we're talking about not in the United States now, we're talking about overseas, right? Our ability to to understand and receive and gather information in this technological environment is becoming more difficult. And that poses certain national security challenges. Also, we think about the rise of nations like China and how important it's going to be to have the intelligence that you need to make smart and strategic and ultimately what I believe are safe decisions, wise decisions for the country if the ways and the methods that you collect intelligence are being hampered, mostly because of the ability to thwart those by other countries. So that's a big challenge. Also, you and I have spoken about, and I know that you've written on in Lawfare, on cyber issues. The importance and the role of cyber is just going to continue to grow. I believe, and I've been working on mutual cyber defense issues, on partnering with other countries on mutual cyber defense. That is an incredibly important and consequential issue for us, not just in terms of our elections, but also in terms of our national defense. Particularly when you think of countries like Russia, North Korea, Iran, and other nations, and non-state actors. So those are some of the big issues. The other part that I would point out, because 2016 was the election was so concussive to the country in terms of a large foreign government interfering with our election, is making sure that we get a hold of, that we pursue election security. I've been surprised the last 2 years to learn that there isn't a single federal law, and I still can't find a state law, that establishes any kind of basic or minimum or baseline level of cybersecurity protections for our voting systems. Now, bear in mind that Texas is one of 12 or 13 states where you don't have to have a paper trail, where the state doesn't have a paper trail for how somebody voted. So I voted in Bexar County early a few days ago, and our machines are from 2002, and they keep no paper record of how we voted. So there's an incredible vulnerability there, and we need to handle that.
Let's stay on the subject of cyber for a moment, and this is also something we chatted about before. When people reference cyber, it means different things to different people. Mostly people think of cybersecurity and the need to defend ourselves. And the truth is the United States has more to defend than anyone else. We're,
right.
as one scholar put it, we're asymmetrically vulnerable because of our success and strengths in digitizing our economy.
And because we're an open society, more transparent society. Absolutely. You go to China, and even when I was there in 2010, you can't get on Facebook, right? So it's a very different approach. You're right. I mean, the approach of other countries is sometimes to shut down, and we've not done that.
Do we need a grand strategy rethink in this area, thinking not just about security, but the ways that these same technologies make us powerful and grow our economy as well?
Yeah, I think we absolutely do. I don't think that we are taking cyber as seriously as we should. Again, I'm not saying that we're not doing anything, that we're not making headway, but I feel as though that the push and the effort should be much larger, that there's got to be a public component, a public education component to it, but also, as I mentioned, working with our partners and allies, which we've not done enough of. A few weeks ago, it was announced that the United States, through NATO, with its NATO allies, would offer assistance and help to our NATO allies in terms of cyber defense. So that's a promising development, that NATO is finally getting serious about the cyber component. That's a good thing. But still, I just feel like we've still got a ways to go based on everything that I've seen, both open source and in a classified setting.
You've mentioned China a few times, both in that context and more generally, and I want to focus on that for a moment. The Vice President recently gave a much remarked upon speech, some people saying it heralded or recognized the arrival of a new Cold War. This comes at about the same time that the Justice Department, for the third time since September, has actually indicted serving Chinese intelligence officers for commercial espionage. Espionage not just for traditional national security purposes, but to capture intellectual property that would then be fed back into industry in competition with our own. There are other examples of these tensions, and of course we have the larger context of what amounts to a trade war, or the early stages of one at least. Are we in a Cold War with China? And in any event, what's the right path forward to thinking about this complicated relationship?
Well, I certainly hope that we're not headed down that way. I don't think that we are, and I think one of the fundamental differences between the relationship with China right now and what we saw with the Soviet Union decades ago is that China is our largest trading partner. You just start with that, right? They're also the largest holder of U.S. debt, which gives them a lot of leverage. But they're still a very important nation in terms of trade, and there are many positive things about the relationship. Still, when we think about China, we have to think about what our broad approach is. And part of my critique of the administration's approach is that I think that it's been fairly scattershot. And I don't know that the president, at least the president, others in the administration, it may be a different story, but that the president has defined his goals with respect to China. So for me, when I think of China, the frame that I'm working from is that I believe that we have to find a way to allow China to compete but not cheat. So how do you define those two things, especially the cheating part? Well, to me, part of that is that you're right, that you've got to crack down on these technology transfers. And the wholesale theft of cutting-edge technology that's being developed by our commercial sector in the United States, and then the application of that by newly developed Chinese companies. You absolutely have to resist that and stand strong against it. So I was glad that the Department of Justice has continued to be aggressive in their indictments. Also, for example, some of the rules that they've set up in terms of mandatory partnering with Chinese companies for American companies. Again, that's been another way where in some instances they've been able to achieve intellectual property theft or technology transfers. But there are other things as well. We're concerned about the militarization of islands in the South China Sea. A huge portion of the world's trade goes through there. And if we look into the horizon 30 or 50 or 70 years out, and China has assumed a position where they can essentially effectively control who comes in and out of those waterways, I mean, that has a huge economic impact, not just for the United States, but for the nations of the world. So we're obviously mindful of that. And then finally, with the Belt and Road Initiative of China, I mean, their GDP is expected to surpass ours around 2030, right? And so they're already the second largest economy. But I feel as though, even though their economy and their position economically in the world has evolved over the decades, their leadership and what they bring to the world has not necessarily kept pace. So what I mean by that is that if you are a leading nation, you should be leading on things like human rights. You should be leading on top flight trade agreements, right? So I have some concerns about RCEP because I don't know that it accomplishes that. Have concerns about China setting up what look like debt traps for countries like Sri Lanka, so that then they're able to take over important assets in a country, after a few years or several years. So those are things that we have to be vigilant about. But let me say this, I don't believe that we should fight with China just to fight for the sake of fighting with China. But we need to figure out a way so that they can compete fairly, as any nation around the world should be able to do, but at the same time not cheat to succeed.
One last question before we open it up to the audience, so please be prepared to put your hand up so I can call on you in a moment. You mentioned the 2016 election, and we've talked about rivalry with China. Let's think about rivalry with Russia. There was a story in the news this morning that National Security Advisor John Bolton had articulated that we have been engaging in what he called offensive cyber operations, but he clarified below the threshold of traditional military operations against the Russians in relation to election interference.
Yeah.
And this follows an earlier story where it was reported that we were actually directly messaging individual Russian operators saying, we've identified you as someone who's trying to sow division or do things such as was done in 2016. Does this mean we're doing enough and that the problem of the Russians has been properly dealt with, or is there more we still should be doing?
Oh, I think there's more that we have to do. I'm encouraged by the steps that social media groups like platforms like Twitter and Facebook have taken in starting to root out all of these bots and trolls and fake accounts. This is pernicious stuff. Just to give you a quick example, in the run-up to the 2016 election, so the Russian troll factory, they were setting up these fake accounts. So they set up 2 fake Facebook pages, and one fake Facebook page was a pro-Confederacy page. And they purposely set up on one street corner in Houston a rally at a certain time. And then it started getting shared and everything, and real Americans, real Texans, showed up at the rally. They also created a competing second Facebook page on the other side of that And the same thing, invited people to come to this rally that was an anti-Confederacy rally on the opposite street corner, and people showed up. So once you put this stuff in the bloodstream, it starts taking on a life of its own. So yeah, so I'm encouraged about that they've been finally on, with prodding from Congress, but without a specific law or regulation, have actually taken action. There's more work to do on that. Again, our mutual cyber defenses, we have to secure our own ship, so to speak. Like, we have to make sure that we're protecting ourselves. And yeah, and all of those things. With Russia, I think their situation is also different from China because they don't have the economy that China has, right? With Russia, they have a few things to offer: their defense systems, their energy assets in particular. But other than that, I mean, a lot of the ways that they gain power are through asymmetric means, like we're talking about, disruptive data dumping and so forth, and trying to mess with elections.
Well, why don't we open it up to the audience? We've got a microphone that's going to float around, so why don't the nearest to you right there with Kelsey, and then we'll begin to make our way as fairly as possible across the room.
Thank you. Just on. Oh, there we go. Thank you so much. That was an incredibly interesting talk. Something that you mentioned that I find really interesting is this tension between kind of this shift in our national security to a global power competition and away from the war on terror, and what that means for our military engagements around the world, and also the role of the Intelligence Oversight Committee. So my question is, if we were to have a new AUMF, what would that do as far as our fight against global terrorism, in your ideal opinion? Yeah. And what role and what tension is there between these AUMF and then covert action in the oversight that you have sitting on HPSI for covert action opportunities? And kind of talk about that tension a little bit there.
I'm trying to figure out how much of that I can say safely, right, without going to jail. Yeah. Let me start with the AUMF. So Congress for 15, 16 years, whatever it's been, has not come up with a new AUMF. Congress has basically been a spectator on a very important and consequential part of American government, which is the use of military force abroad. And I don't think the American people should let members of Congress get away with that. I think that we ought to take a stab at a new AUMF. What exactly it would look like, I think look, we haven't considered one in years. President Obama, the White House, put out basically a draft one in 2013, and it went nowhere. It was dead on arrival. The Foreign Affairs Committee was supposed to take it on, and it never went anywhere. So it's got to be a debate and discussion within the Congress about what that AUMF looks like. So Congress has to jump back in, right, and not cede so much control and power to the executive. And I do feel that after 9/11, some of that was understandable because we were in a moment of crisis, and it was almost as if the Congress was saying to the president, look, we're giving you all the power that you need to act swiftly and decisively against the people who have caused this harm to the American people. But it's been many years, and we've also been engaged in different conflicts over that period of time without updating this authorization for use of military force. And we ought to take a stab at it. In terms of the tension, part of it, I can only speak broadly to that, but part of it also depends on what the AUMF looks like, right? I will say that I think that we ought to be as transparent as possible in what we're doing. That in the end, some things, of course, are classified, but in the end, I think transparency from the beginning benefits everybody, including elected officials. And part of the reason, again, that people have not wanted to take a vote on the AUMF is because if you remember the Iraq War vote, there are many people that ended up basically being ushered out of politics because how they voted on the Iraq War vote. So there's been this fear among members of Congress that, oh, I'm going to authorize something and then I'm going to lose an election if things go sour or if the intelligence was bad. I mean, that's a political fear, but you got elected into office to take these tough votes, including on this stuff. So I've been advocating, and others have as well, that Congress step up and take action.
Let's move the microphone actually all the way up here. There's Diane in the back on the the row that begins here.
Thank you so much, sir. Following up on Bobby's first question, you
Yes.
started with discussing HPSI dysfunction, which
Yes.
is also true of SSCI.
Yeah.
My question is, HPSI and SSCI were stood up 41 years ago. There's not only been a tremendous change in the sources and types of threats the intelligence community is addressing in those 41 years, but also a tremendous sea change within Congress itself in how the committee systems work, how parties work together, et cetera.
Yes.
My question is, what part, if any, of the dysfunction that we know is there is due not to partisanship and politics, but to the institutions themselves not meeting the need? And if so, how would you reorganize oversight to better fit the current needs?
That's obviously a great and broad question, right? But let me speak as a committee member and being on the HPSI committee the last 2.5 years, and what I've noticed and what I think is one of the biggest challenges that we face is lack of comprehensive information. What I mean by that is that when you have, if you're a policymaker and you have on the dais the CIA or the FBI or another agency that has come to testify on a particular week and on a particular issue, often the work that they're doing will interface with what other agencies are doing. Yet, almost hardly ever, basically the problem is that nobody is ever in the same room, right? So to get a complete answer to your question or a full understanding of the situation, you may need to hear from 3 of the different intelligence agencies that are dealing with a certain challenge. And from my experience so far, 2.5 years, hardly ever do you get everybody in the same room to give you a complete understanding of what is going on. Let me analogize this a little bit to the situation at the border with immigrants or migrants. You've got DHS that's got a part of the issue with Border Patrol and ICE, but you also have HHS that is handling the folks in certain detention centers. And it's the same challenge, is that oftentimes nobody, you'll meet with the Secretary of Homeland Security, but you don't have the HHS secretary there. And so it becomes easy for departments and agencies to say, oh, well, we don't handle that, or I don't, we're not read into that. So that structurally as an institution, that's been a big challenge, is figuring out that piece. There's the regular reauthorization of the Intelligence Act that basically covers some of, I wouldn't say wholesale reorganization, but tries to tweak things here and there in terms of reporting requirements and other initiatives. So that's been helpful. But I think part of the challenge also is that at least on the House side, we're not allowed to use any of our staff members to be part of hearing the discussions or taking in the testimony. On the Senate side, each of the senators is allowed a staff member to hear what's going on and to work with the member of the Senate. So the reason that I say that, and the reason that it's important when you think about the sharing of responsibility between the executive branch or the agencies and the legislative branch, is that the only time that you can ever do work as a legislator on HPSI, on these intelligence issues, is when you go down into the dungeon known as the SCIF, the basement in the Congress. Well, I mean, if you look at my schedule when I'm in Washington, it's like thing after thing after thing, right? So what it does, what I found that it does, is it really empowers the professional staff on the committee, but then also empowers more than I think it should, the people in the agencies, because again, the only way that the legislators are going to get information on this is when you can actually go down there into the SCIF. I can't call the FBI director and have a conversation with him about a classified issue on the phone, right? Because it's classified information. and because the phone is not necessarily secure. So that creates, if you're looking at it from a legislative perspective, it creates a real challenge.
Why don't we go with the gentleman in the black T-shirt there?
Thank you. If you could wave a magic wand.
Leave the microphone in her hand, please. Thank you.
If you wave the magic wand and the Trump administration got active in South America and Latin America to solve the problems there that are producing waves of immigrants toward the U.S., what would you do?
Oh man, that's a great question. I just voted for Beto 2 days ago. So. Well, I think it's part of what we saw, which was over the last few years, Congress made hundreds of millions of dollars in investment in the Northern Triangle countries. Look, the solution, I think, is not to try to bully the countries or to threaten them. It is to work with them on rooting out problems with corruption, but also in building their economies up. I fundamentally believe that wherever somebody lives, for the most part, the large majority of people have no interest in leaving their home country, that they want to stay at the place that they're from. You know, I doubt there's a lot of people that want to walk 1,000 miles to go to some other place. So it would be to work with these countries in a more ambitious way, a more ambitious and more meaningful way than we have. And it's not just money. I think it's other kinds of support. You know, that said, look, the money that we committed over the last few years, I don't think anybody believes that $500 million is going to overnight turn around the economies of Guatemala or El Salvador. It's a longer process than that, right? We're not gonna solve it overnight, but we could do a lot better job of being more fully invested.
Let's come back around here in the back of this row. There's a gentleman with his hand up.
Regarding the situation of the greatest humanitarian crisis going on at this time in Yemen, you didn't address that.
Sure.
We've always taken the moral high ground, but it seems we have been complicit in supplying arms to the Saudis, and they have bombed the devil out, and we've got mass starvation, and that is never addressed. And so I wonder if you'd comment on the failure of the United States to have done something, because the UN is suggesting that there should be a ceasefire. Why didn't we, as the beacon on the hill, lead the charge?
You ask a great, important, and moral question, and I do think that we should freeze arms sales to Saudi Arabia as leverage, at least for now, to have them stop doing what they're doing in Yemen. The level of desperation and famine over there, I just read a few days ago, could rival among the worst famines that the world has ever seen, certainly in the modern era. So I agree that we should take strong action to stop it. I think that we have the leverage to stop it. As to your question about, why it hasn't happened before, I think that there has been, in this case, too much deference to the relationship that the United States has historically with Saudi Arabia.
Okay, let's bring the microphone down on this aisle, the gentleman about 5 rows down.
Thank you for coming today. So one thing I have been impressed by in the last couple of years as an example of bipartisanship has been the consistent rejection of the Trump administration's proposed cuts to foreign affairs and foreign aid. And my question is, what is your sense of where Congress generally on both sides stands on our funding of aid and the State Department and related operations going forward?
No, you're right. I mean, I was, like a lot of other people, kind of shell-shocked when the president had his first budget proposal. He wanted to cut the State Department by 31%. I mean, you're talking about almost a third cut, and a lot of that in development assistance, USAID and so forth. So fortunately, Congress has rejected that, and so that's a very positive thing. I do think that the Foreign Affairs Committee is a lot like the Intelligence Committee has been, which is it tends to be more bipartisan. So there is still a good bit of sentiment in the Congress this idea that the United States ought to kind of withdraw from the world. And the way it's pitched is really what the president has done, which is America first, right? That you ought to focus on this country first. But the part of the consequence of that is the withdrawal of not just development assistance, but also the number of diplomats around the world in post. And so I'm grateful that the Congress, and obviously with the cooperation of both parties, has rejected that. And one of the things that I stood up for strongly, in addition to USAID, was a lot of the fellowship programs that allow young people to make their way into the diplomatic corps, to make sure that we have a steady stream of people going into the diplomatic corps. So I suspect that it's going to continue to be a fight over the next few years, but we'll keep up the battle.
That topic and the prior question that brought up the risk of famine in Yemen reminds me that I meant to ask you about your work, I think with Congressman McCall, on food security.
That's right.
And I believe you have a bill that's been moving on that topic.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear something about that.
Yeah, no, that's right. Let me preface it by saying this. All of my time in public service, I've always been in the minority party, right? So when I was in the legislature, I was pretty much in the deep minority except for one term. And in Congress, I've been in the deep minority. And so everything that I've done and tried to do has been basically in a bipartisan way. And one of those things has been working on cyber issues, and in this case, food security issues with Mike McCall, a congressman represents part of Austin, Houston. And to make sure that food assistance is available to nations that are facing, basically famine and are in desperate need.
It's important work. Let's bring the microphone here to Admiral Inman. I'm sorry to make you move so much around the room.
Getting my exercise in for the day.
And thank you, Admiral, for joining us today, too. Thank you for being here.
You may not say that.
Should have waited for your question first.
I want to expand a bit on the Yemen problem and the pressure on Saudis and the UAE to stop what they're doing. I commend. But the reason that civil war is still going are the Iranians and their support for the Houthis, and they're providing the most modern equipment that can reach. So I don't see how we're going to really accomplish something other than enabling Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula unless we can somehow also stop the Iranian support for the Houthis. How do we do that?
Yeah. No, you're right. Because you're right. There are two sides here in this battle, and we do need to use every leverage point that we can on Iran. And that's why I think the calls for a ceasefire, first of all, are the most appropriate, right? First, you need to, everybody stop, right? Both sides stop. Now, I guess my answer on Yemen with Saudi Arabia, on our side, part of our leverage to make the folks that we've been supplying weapons to stop is basically to threaten to not supply them with weapons, right? And on the other side, we need to do everything that we can, you're right, to get Iran first to stop and then ultimately to pull out of their support. So, no, that's a point well taken.
Okay, a little more time. Why don't we come here to the gentleman about 3 rows in.
Hi, Representative. Thank you for being here. So we touched on U.S. actions that can be undertaken to safeguard our own security against malicious Russian meddling and influence, but what can be done for our allies in Europe and across the world that are experiencing similar behavior from Russia?
I think that's where mutual cyber defense comes in. That's why I said it was really promising that the United States offered its NATO allies assistance, like real assistance in cyber, and making sure that that's available to everybody, to all the countries, partner countries. You look at what's happened in some parts of Eastern Europe, certainly in Ukraine. Russia's been very aggressive over there. And what we experienced as Americans in 2016, some of these other countries had been experiencing for several years, right? So it's not like we got hit first. So working with our European allies, making sure that NATO fully transitions, the way I see it, from not just being a body where we protect each other against any kind of physical intrusion of a country, but also that we protect each other against any kind of meaningful cyber intrusion. When I say that, I'm always careful because I was speaking to a group of German legislators once, and I made the point about mutual cyber defense, and they took it to mean that I say, well, they mess with our election, we fire a missile over there. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that in terms of our cyber defense, but also, if necessary, our cyber response. How do we make sure that we're secure, that we have an offensive capability, and that we can also help our allies and Europe, especially because they've been dealing with the Russians for a while.
Okay. We'll go right there near you.
Hi. So we talked about how we're an open society and how in certain ways that makes us vulnerable to some of the attacks, the election interference that we saw in 2016 on behalf of the Russians. I was wondering, is anybody in the intelligence community or in the House of Representatives talking about civic education, right? I know it's not as sexy as kind of cybersecurity and stuff like that, but just civics as a way to, as a defense mechanism or as a kind of a solution to that problem, right? We have so many people don't even know who their congressional representatives are. A huge portion of our population doesn't vote. I mean, is anybody talking about that as a possible defense mechanism that we need to work on?
Like civic education just generally about government and so forth? Yeah, Yeah. That's what government class is supposed to be, right? Like, I mean, in high school and middle school and then college. But for example, I had a roundtable discussion with some students earlier, and I got the specific question about a public campaign or a campaign in schools on cybersecurity, basically cyber hygiene. And there has been some discussion of that, but it hasn't been actualized yet. But I do think it's going to happen at some point. I can't tell you exactly what form it's going to take, but I mean, think about it, y'all. Every element of American society just about is touched by cyber threats. We've talked about the government one with the elections. But before that, you had the Sony dump, remember, that North Korea, we believe, was responsible for. I remember talking to an executive at Sony shortly after that said that he woke up and that there were 10 years of his emails on the internet, right, that had been dumped. Businesses large and small continue to be hacked because it's not just nations that are trying to find secrets or anything, but it's also these rogue people that make money off of using other people's credit cards for stuff, right? So, I mean, every level of society, from government to large and small businesses to the individual, is affected. And I think we have to move to a more targeted kind of campaign. So,
I'm going to follow up a little bit on that one, because this question of perhaps losing touch with civic virtue is something I think a lot about and very concerned about. I think it's at the root of what you're asking. Are we, maybe it's an illusion that we used to have more sense of shared civic virtue, a belief in certain principles and certain things that bind us that have nothing to do with our backgrounds, but what we are committed to as principles. Have we lost touch with that, and can we get it back?
You know, that is a great question. And I see some hope in what we see now in terms of this massive response in terms of voter turnout, for example, in people getting more engaged in participating in our democracy. This midterm, I think, is going to break all the records for midterms. I don't want to say ever, but at least for a very long, long time. So the silver lining in a lot of the tension that this country has experienced, intense tension that this country has experienced over the past 2 years, is that more people are getting engaged. But yeah, there is still a very big challenge with people not engaging and sometimes not aware of, I mean, for example, a few years ago, my mom lives on the west side of San Antonio where I grew up, and I was going to visit her, and I stopped in at this bakery a few blocks from her house, and it was near the election, and this man recognized me, and he actually thought I was my brother, but I'll say he recognized me. And I said, "Oh, have you voted?" And the man said, "You know, I wanted to vote, but I don't know like who the candidates are. I don't know what they stand for," right? And part of the reason that I think more people don't engage is not because necessarily they just hate politics or they hate anything with democracy, it's because people feel like they're missing information. Like there's this lack of information to get to that point. And their premise or their operating principle is almost, I don't want to do any harm. Like I don't know what, and I've done it myself in races in the past for the River Authority or something, right? I'll see a race on the ballot, there's no partisan, there's no RRD, there's no clues as to who stands for what, and it's two names, and I don't know who either of the people is, so I just don't vote in the race, right? Because I don't want to pick the wrong person. Well, I think there's a lot of people that are operating like that because they lack the information that they feel they need to jump in and actually engage. So yes, we have a long way to go in making sure that more people have information on a basic level in terms of like who the governor is, who's your senator, who's your congressperson, but also on more sophisticated stuff like political issues too.
All right, we'll take one last one, and let's see, you're closest to this gentleman here in the vest, if you can get across the aisle to the middle of the second column here. That's it.
Which one? Sorry.
Right down there. Wasn't that close after all.
Thank you so much for being here. So we've been talking a lot about cybersecurity, and even last week, the Deputy Director of NSA, George Barnes, was here speaking about cybersecurity issues. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, as the decision maker and as the congressman, do you see a future in creating a national cyber intel agency or something of that sort to specifically combat the growing cyber threats pertaining to the U.S. and globally?
Yeah, there's been discussion and debate about that, right? Do I think the issue is important enough to have a singular agency that handles it? Yeah, I would say yes. The question is how you distribute that responsibility though, right? I mean, you've got the Air Force, for example, that has an intel wing. You've got basically 17 intelligence agencies. How do you divide that up and the responsibility up in the best and most coherent way? So I can't tell you that right now I can give you a complete answer, yes or no, because it's something that I'm still thinking through. But I do think that it's going to be a topic of more and more discussion as we go forward.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for displaying your civic virtue by being here. Congressman, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. We can